Hey everyone, welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. We're doing a series of special interviews this week from PorcFest in New Hampshire. This is a project of the Free State Project, and it's a gathering of libertarians and constitutional conservatives, Republicans. We even had some converted progressives here who are looking for liberty, and we're hanging out in this beautiful place, and these conversations are going to be awesome. Check it out. We'll be okay. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Gene, how's it going?
Going great, in a great mood. Got to PorcFest Tuesday evening, and just I feel among so many friends, so many people who appreciate what I do, but also so many people who have so much to say and so much to teach me, you included.
So is this your first PorcFest?
It is, to my great embarrassment, my first PorcFest, and I've obviously missed out on a lot. I'm 76 and still getting my kicks at 76. But life is improving even more now that I've made my first PorcFest and recognized that there's so much life and so much vitality and so much intellect among libertarians, even more than I thought ever existed before.
So I want to talk about the Soho Forum,
Yeah.
but before we do that, we'll just talk about what you're doing here, because you are the guy that hosts debates amongst libertarians and classical liberals, but other sides as well, right?
Yeah, all the sides that we can get, you know, absolutely. If it's a debatable issue at all, and you know, I love what I do. I get a chance to run it just according to the way I like. I've got three loyal people, my wife included, who caters our parties. And indeed, the Soho Forum, I should emphasize, however, has had a twofold mission, not just to hold debates of interest to libertarians, which sort of means of interest to me, and hopefully my interests reflect most other people's, not always, but that's just the way it goes. However, we have sold out every event now for the last couple of years in a hall of more than 200 people, but also, I think part of the attraction is that the second-fold mission is to make it a group experience, have a party afterwards.
Yeah.
And you know, there are some of us, amazingly enough, who, when we see people at a bar talking convivially, we get an anxiety attack. Will we fit in? Will they accept us? What are we going to say? Well, at the Soho Forum, you can always discuss the debate, something to talk about, an icebreaker, and a way to get to know other people, other libertarians. And of course, there are people who mix with us who are not libertarian. We then had to go on Zoom for our debates for most of last year, and that was a bit of a downer, but at least we had some decent, worthy debates on Zoom. And all of our debates, I should emphasize, but for podcast listeners especially, are available at the Soho Forum Debates podcast. That's the Soho Forum Debates podcast. We started in the fall of 2016, and so we have over 50 debates of interest to libertarians. The topics are pretty obvious as you scan down the list if you go into that podcast. I've done, I guess, 7 debates, and somewhat to my embarrassment, 3 of them were with socialists. Mm-hmm. And I publicly declared that I will not have another debate with a socialist. The trilogy was enough, unless I get some sort of raucous challenge from a socialist to debate that person. I guess I shouldn't refuse a challenge, but probably after my 3, I'm not going to get any challenges, so I can be comfortable that my debating career with socialists is over.
So why is it unfun to debate socialists?
Why is it unfun? It's not. Look, it's not totally unfun. Although I should add, by the way, let me generalize about all debates. Tom Woods, you're going to hear him tomorrow say that when you're a public speaker, everybody in the audience is pulling for you. Recognize that. They want you to do well, even if you screw up a little bit. They want you to do well, and they regard that as a joke. And I always tell Tom, a big fat asterisk has to be fit there, unless you're doing a debate at the Soho Forum. And indeed, I should even put a fine point on that about doing a debate at the Soho Forum, because I believe in one-on-one debates. that defines the Soho Forum format. One person against one person. I do feel that the committee style, where it's 2 against 2, often doesn't work. Each person doesn't get enough time to talk. I mean, they often, unlike college debating, which might have its own problems, they often haven't even conversed. They haven't even planned and coordinated what they're going to say. And so I think it doesn't work out. If you are responsible for your argument, you're the only one defending your argument. You can't lean back on the politician they teamed you up with, whoever he is, to help carry the ball. And now, of course, that takes a risk, because clearly, if the 2 people I get are not especially great, they want to mix it up with a duo just to sort of hedge their bets. So I take more of a risk when I do it that way. But that keys in to why it's a stressful occasion, because it's just you against somebody else. So not everybody in the audience is pulling for you when you do a Soho Forum debate, because half the audience may have their knives out for you, although not necessarily the one that we just did on strategy for the Libertarian Party versus the Free State. That debate was done very spiritedly, but with love. However, in other cases, especially when I did debates with socialists, and especially when I did those debates in New York City, the first 2 were done in New York City. The third was sponsored by the young gentleman back there named Sam, who moderated the debate, and we held that in Florida. So there were fewer people who were socialists in that particular audience. However, when the Q&A starts, the intensity of the questions and the hatred that they extend toward me when I do a debate with a socialist is palpable, because I really get under their skin. Especially under their skin with my argument, which is because my key argument with all 3 has been that the best aspects of socialism are readily achievable under free market capitalism, and that I insist that the mistake is to define capitalism in the Marxist sense, that it's workers and employers, workers and capitalists. That's one manifestation of capitalism. It seems to be the most popular. However, there are worker co-ops. There always have been. The corporation dominates, but who knows whether that will last. Capitalism is simply private property rights and the means of production certified by law, and that's it. And then how you structure it is up for grabs. You want to create a kibbutz-like environment where everybody gets a vote and everybody does it democratically. That's up to you. I dare say I spoke to a couple of you young people who were escorting me over here for this interview, and they talked about, one of the young lady talked about working for you guys for 10 years and calling it a family. Who knows how we characterize your particular enterprise?
Yeah.
Who knows how much, how much this, the odd part is, if you remember, Gary Becker won an award for saying that a family is like a firm, and I once quipped that you could probably argue that many firms are like a family.
Right.
So therefore, let 100 flowers bloom, which is actually the accurate statement originally from Mao Zedong. He said only 100 flowers. 100 flowers are plenty to bloom, and that's capitalism.
So you're a Maoist, really?
I'm a Maoist in that sense,
Yeah.
a capitalist Maoist. So the point is that I get under their skin because, again, I emphasize that if there's all that anger out there about being wage and salary employees, then it's going to change. It should have changed overnight. All that success with Mondragon in Spain that you supposedly tout with worker ownership, then why don't we have Mondragons of similar size in the U.S. yet? Maybe some of us would rather be wage and salary employees.
Yeah.
And so anyway, you forced me to digress under that. You were asking me about debating generally, about speaking generally. Now I'm even forgetting your question. And
well, I want to go back to socialism.
Yeah, okay,
This is an interesting subject because I'm one of those guys that hesitate to use the C word, capitalism. I feel I feel like it, whatever it originally meant, and I never thought the market process was fundamentally about capital accumulation.
Yeah.
But particularly young people today, when they hear the word capitalism, what they really hear is cronyism, because they grew up watching Wall Street get bailed out by politicians in Washington, D.C.
I call that crapitalism, but go ahead.
Yeah.
But okay.
I'll use that.
Okay.
It's but I'm thinking, as I do, I love to think about dead economists, and Ludwig von Mises described the market as a process.
Yeah.
And I've taken that and I've bastardized it, and if it's just this process of people just trying to figure stuff out.
Yeah.
And part of the way they do that is through competition. Part of the way they do that is through cooperation.
Yeah.
It's iterations of mistakes and successes, just trying to make your way through this
trial and error,
unknowable future world.
Yeah.
And to me, like there's got to be a way to explain capitalism without calling it capitalism, so that people that think they're socialists, but they're not socialists. They're about bottom up. They're about community. They're about people figuring stuff out. That's what freedom allows you to do. A central plan never gets you there.
Yeah, well, no, I basically agree with you, and I find I love semantics, I love linguistics, and thinking about words and what they mean, and how they change their meaning over time. It certainly fascinates me. Of course, we have the term free market. I'm only concerned, having debated the issue and having seen so many young people out there with their knives out for me, with respect to the arguments I make. If I say free market, they're going to laugh. But indeed, I guess I've settled on the idea of accepting the word capitalism, although I grant your point that you don't necessarily have to accept it, and I think that's part of your style and part of who you are. I define myself basically as an economist who knows numbers and who can cite numbers like, the lower 90% accounts for nearly 80% of all consumer spending, and that the lower 90% is presumably your proletariat, right? The other 10% are the capitalists, more or less, but they control the consumer dollar, and they can use the consumer dollar to favor worker-owned firms. So I start with that. But getting back to the point, so I settle on capitalism for my crony capitalism, and then use the word capitalism, partly because I suppose when I define capitalism, which I get, or the free market, where you, I think, would it be, or unless you want to modify my definition, which is that we do have to say that it is property rights in the means of production enforced by law, be it an ANCAP kind of society or a minarchist kind of society, but there is legal rights in that property in the means of production, and means of production, despite all the intangible capital out there, which I think is a fascinating subject in itself, the capital that you can't touch, which is extremely valuable. And of course, your Kibbe Inc. is intangible capital. Of course, you've got that. You've got this tent, and you've got that.
I mean, it's huge. It's a big enterprise.
Big enterprise. So you've got that trailer, so you have property rights in that means of production that helps produce the kibbutznik, the Kibbe output, and so on. And you have those properties. My point is that I have to say assertively that it is that. I'm not going to be squishy and not define what I mean. I'm just, as I say, it just means that then let 100 flowers bloom. So that's why I'm sort of stuck with it. But I know, look, I could talk about what you were saying the other day. Enjoyed your talk when you were talking about selfishness versus being unselfish. And of course, I had a debate with Yaron Brook about selfishness, by the way. Yaron Brook is Iranian, and I have to say, privately, I'm happy to notice that the last time I encountered Yaron, I had him debate John Mackey. He was using the word self-interest, not selfishness. Yeah. And indeed, obviously, self-interest, which is a term that was used by, obviously, Adam Smith most famously, and gets back to an old Jewish saying, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? All of that is healthy, but I wanted Yaron to understand that, just as you said, by the way, and as I put it when I debated Yaron, that if I had spent my first 22 years under the yoke of Bolshevism, where they keep telling me you're selfish unless you serve the state, and I should add, I met some young people in Romania, in Bucharest, who loved Ayn Rand and who loved her selfishness as a virtue thing, because they too were told, you're selfish unless you serve the state. I would shout to the rooftops that selfishness is a virtue. Yeah. But I think it's a little bit outmoded. I think you have to make your peace with the fact that the word has not budged. Yeah. I went back to Samuel Johnson's dictionary up to and Adam Smith even used the word selfish as a pejorative. How selfish soever man is, there's a certain compassion in him. So therefore, although I respected everything you said the other day, because you basically made my point about where Ayn Rand came from, and of course the awesome achievement that she should be credited with, about how she overcame it, came to this country, country and contributed so much to our thinking. But I think that's antiquated. But getting back then to the word capitalism, I'm sort of stuck with it for that reason, partly because on the debater circuit, I'm so used to the antagonism that I get whenever I start saying free market or something else. I'm able then to point out 100 flowers can bloom once I define it and once I go on to elaborate about it.
So I used to do the Bill Maher show all the time.
Oh my gosh.
And my wife would sit in the audience, and it wasn't half and half. The visceral hatred for every word I said was something else. But that's that's almost fun because you sort of feed off of that. And I always think about it like when I debate somebody, and let's say somebody from the other side, and maybe it's someone from the right or someone radical progressive or something like that. I always figure that my job's not to convince them of anything. It's to get any potential audience to sort of rethink and question their own conclusions. And that falls into the language thing because, so many words are so tribal now. And you say the word capitalism, and some people's minds just shut down. They're like, okay, I know who he is. So I always, like, whatever word I use, I then go ahead and define it in the context of what I think are hopefully more universal values so that people understand what you meant by that word. Because language is this spontaneously evolving thing, particularly with social media. I can't keep up with the new words that the kids are using today.
Me neither. Yeah.
But I like for instance, and here at PorcFest and with the Mises Caucus guys, they hate the word democracy. And I think that's a big mistake.
Oh, wow. Okay, then we're about to have a Soho Forum-like debate about the word, but okay. Well, I'm sorry, you probably have a good point to make about why you shouldn't hate the word democracy.
There's a vulgar meaning of democracy that means 50 plus one person gets to do whatever they want to the other 49%. Yeah. That's
piss in the soup of the other 49%, as we like to say.
That's not democracy in my mind. I think a market is radically democratic because everybody's voting all the time. Everybody's choosing what they want, but there's no losers in the same sense that there is when we use so-called democracy to make political decisions. So and whether we like it or not, big D democracy is now almost this term of religious endurance and I say we don't give up these words. Like community is the same thing. My title at Free the People is Chief Community Organizer.
Oh, yes.
And that triggers some people. And I'm like, are you against being organized or the community? So I don't want to give up these really cool words that are rich with meaning beyond sort of the vulgar caricature of democracy as this God that empowers the majority to persecute the minority.
Yeah.
Are you buying this?
Yeah, no, indeed. No, absolutely. Of course, I completely agree with you about the term community, which is always a very important concept for me, having been raised by a communist mom. And I, of course, insist that all communities have to be voluntary, and that I would, by the way, even like to see more worker co-ops because I think more people will learn about the headaches and problems of running an enterprise. I'd like to see more of that voluntary socialism happening. Getting back to your point about democracy, I do like your point, and I think that's your particular niche to the extent that you have claims to being brilliant and something to contribute. That seeing things differently and seeing different things, which is I think part of your value of what you contribute to what we all have to learn as libertarians. Indeed. That's part of my hobby horse as well, although I didn't put it your way, which is again that 80% of nearly 80% of the consumer spending comes from the lower 90%. Thomas Sowell actually was the only economist I ever know who wrote about this briefly in Knowledge and Decisions when he talked about the allocation under capitalism, the division of knowledge, which is what that great book is about under market conditions. And he said, some people dismiss the idea because rich people, after all, have more votes. to cast than poor people. But as he said, as a practical matter, since we 90% poor people greatly outnumber the rich people, even in this society of income inequality, of crony capitalism, I would say at the end of the day, probably in a free market, probably the lower 90% would have more than 80% of the votes. By and large, we all know the great fortunes, 99% of the great fortunes are made by selling to the masses. That's Sam Walton, that's Jeff Bezos, that's Steve Jobs. If you can't get the masses to buy it, you're not going to become a billionaire most of the time. And so that as a practical matter, it's really that the top 10% is investing their money to please the lower 90% as a first approximation with very few differences. So therefore, and then that's the part of it that copes with the idea of the inequality of the number of votes you can cast. So it isn't one man, one vote. But then, of course, you get to the key advantage that you point out, which is that there are no losers, that your minority vote can still get, so far, Matt Kibbe has not sold his product to 51% of the population, but somehow or other, he's still getting enough votes in his favor so that he can continue to sell his product. That key overwhelming advantage, which is our different kind of minority democracy, is the key killer point. And so again, I can only contribute the point that if you really want to go toe to toe with a one person, one vote Democrats, you actually do pretty well anyway, insofar as that conflict is concerned. And then at the end of the day, you do far better because it isn't winner take all.
Yeah. The markets are all about defending the rights of the minority.
Yes, all about defending the rights of minority. And again, people of limited means have enormous influence over the market outcomes. Yeah.
So you mentioned Thomas Sowell, and I'm thinking specifically about the book Knowledge and Decisions, which was basically translating Hayek into more understandable stories in plain English.
Taking a few pages of Hayek and turning it into a 400-page book where again, since I think Thomas Sowell is a genius, and since I think he's a giant, I always like to criticize the genius and giant, even though toward the end of the book he's suddenly talking about foreign policy for extended number of pages, which has nothing to do with the book itself. Yeah. However, the first 350 pages of that book I think is brilliant, and I've always been surprised when people consider it to be a little bit dense. I regard it as extremely readable. He has an incredible imagination and energy at research, so he comes up with so many examples to apply to the Hayekian concept to, which is how we divide, how we communicate knowledge under market conditions. But I think you were going to talk about it. I interrupted you. What were you going to say?
I don't even know. But when people ask me, so we talk about Hayek a lot on this show because I'm a huge Hayek fanatic. Yeah. But when people ask me, Hayek has written so much and it's so dense, what should I start with? I always say, go read Knowledge and Decisions by Thomas Sowell.
No, that's a great idea, absolutely. And it's funny. Maybe you know the story that Reason magazine, I think it was probably Nick Gillespie at Reason magazine when he was editor, or maybe his predecessor, got Hayek to review the book. And I don't
know the story.
Well, no, it's just funny that you should read Hayek's review. Hayek actually, was very pleased by the book, and he said, I delayed reading the book because I was busy with my own project. But now, having read the book, I realized I should have read this book before I got onto my next project because it taught me so much. And then he goes on to say, and I especially appreciate it. And then he says, and then he elaborates. I especially appreciated what occurs on page 98, page 72. He gives a page listing, and I said, I guess they were so in awe, and that's it. And they were so. I was a book review editor, and when I was at Barron's, and I said I would have asked the great man would you please elaborate on those what did you like about page this, page that? But again, at least if you have a copy of the book and you see what Hayek is referencing, what page number, then you can see what did Hayek especially like about that, about Knowledge and Decisions. Although it would have been great if Hayek had been pushed to elaborate on what he meant. But I guess again they were so in awe of getting this guy to do the review, they didn't want to push him at all. But anyway, indeed, that's a book to read. And although now I have to ask you, why don't you mention Murray Rothbard ever?
There's a reason for that.
Yeah.
So like when I went to school at George Mason, we had a chance to go see Murray Rothbard all the time, and I famously have told the story. I had my first real beer with Murray Rothbard.
Well, that should be reason.
In Palo Alto.
Yeah.
But the reason I don't is because I think I started off reading Ayn Rand when I was a kid. That was my gateway as a lot of people. So I had that sort of hardcore Rage Against the Machine individualism thing. I had that part down. I could be an angry libertarian.
Murray Rothbard loved that book. You know?
And Murray, like I always put Murray in that camp.
Yeah.
And later when I went to Mason, a dear mentor of mine, Don Lavoie, turned me on to Hayek and that whole continental philosophy tradition.
Oh yeah.
And I struggled for a while to sort of square it with sort of the Randian objectivist thing, and I ended up abandoning some of that project to better understand Hayek. So it's a matter of emphasis, because I think libertarians generally are not good about explaining the power of community. And that's like Hayek is almost a communitarian. I think he would be upset with that definition, but he was explaining the power of what happens when people are free to come together, and create, like Don Lavoie called it, and this will sound sort of socialist. He called the market process the way that we can create a greater social intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think Ayn Rand would freak out if she heard the phrase greater social intelligence. And so, like, just my fascination. I don't talk about Murray that much because a lot of his work, I'm not treating him fairly here, but I sort of put him in the Rand camp. Like, he's the individualist.
Okay. Yeah. Well, no, that's a fair comment. That's a matter of taste. As a matter of fact, though, if I were asked, I would indeed probably echo your point and say, read the greatest popularization ever written of a great essay, Knowledge and Decisions. If you want to get a taste of what Hayek ended up admiring and thinking, this guy has really taken my views to a new level. Not just the division of labor, but the division of knowledge, and contributed something unique to it. From Hayek's rather compressed essay on the subject, Hayek, of course, writing English as a second language and pretty competently, but not quite with the panache of Thomas Sowell. However, if then pressed, what should I read by Hayek? You know what I would say? The Mirage of Social Justice, because that's a somewhat unpleasant tonic. That book, that's the second in the series on liberty. I mean, he did a trilogy on liberty. I forget the full title, but this one was basically called The Mirage of Social Justice, and the only way, where he does basically say that just as we gave up long ago looking for the just price, it's just as foolish to look for the just wage, and so you might say it's a kind of a cynical view of the world, but although I don't regard it as such, but certainly I think a lot of young people have got to. I think it would be good if they understood that. I'm actually going to mention. I'm going to do a talk tomorrow about wages and salaries tomorrow at the Anthem, just to advertise that. But I'm going to talk about that. I should say that the only part of it where Hayek then goes over a series of examples and basically says how impossible it really is for us to claim that all wages and salaries are justly allocated. The example I used when I used to lecture on Thomas Piketty's crazy book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, and he, of course, assumes that we're all defending capitalism on the basis of some concept of merit, that everybody gets their just desserts under capitalism, under free market, as we may call it. But, of course, we don't assume that. And, of course, the first statement I made is Thomas Piketty has probably made millions of euros from the international sale of his book. I think his book is without merit. It is worthless. But am I going to begrudge him all that money? the other joke about that book is that somebody pointed out that in the Kindle edition, the records that were kept showed that nobody marked it. All the markings did not go past page 22. So the guy said this gets the award of the best-selling book that was most unread because it is dead. I plowed through every damn page of it.
Sorry about that.
Well, I had to because I wanted to review it. And by the way, I found at the end of the day that he doesn't even apply his notion. The notion is that capitalists accumulate wealth like a Malthusian idea, that wealth is accumulated at a geometric rate, and that's why the capitalists get so rich, and that's capitalism's problem. So we have to punitively tax wealth. But did you know that when he gets to the U.S., he literally says that he can't apply his model to the U.S., the bête noire. He then inveighs against CEO salaries. That's what he talks about, that the CEOs get paid too much. It reduces to that. So it's basically old wine in that new bottle. And again, I digressed on that. But getting back to Hayek, the point is that when I used to lecture about that and point that out, I know there was a certain objection, and there is something to it. Certainly in a particular work environment where I was a journalist at Barron's, so I had a certain standard about. I didn't care. I recognized I was economics columnist, and Barron's is written for people who want to read about the stock market every day. People who want to follow the stock market the way you follow a sport. And I wasn't even that kind of person, so I had the privilege of writing about the economy. And they never rotated me. They just kept me in that particular niche where I was happy. I earned considerably less than a number of the stars who could really write about the stock market with pizzazz, but I thought, well, they merit that. They're contributing. So therefore, you do often have a sense of merit in your narrow work environment. If you believe in the purposes of the organization, there is a certain feeling that this person contributes more, and you like to see a certain fairness. Yes, on the firm level, on the level of those people who are more closely around you in the market economy. However, Hayek is still totally right that if you're going to broaden that to the larger economy, then you're going to really run into trouble. Because there's so many things, so many people who make fortunes of money, and I see no merit in what they do. So what am I going to do? Begrudge them the capitalist act between consenting adults, to echo Robin Nozick? So that was Hayek's. I think that was an important contribution of Hayek, and it was very tough-minded, a very readable book. I don't know if you have the same opinion of that book.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah,
I just remembered, by the way, that this morning when I was talking to Dave Smith, I quoted Murray Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State. So
there
it
you
does
are.
happen.
So
it does happen.
I hope you remembered it right, because I have that book. What did you quote?
I don't remember.
Don't remember? Don't remember what you quoted?
Was anyone here? What did I say? I don't know. Well, we'll go back to the tape
remembers.
later.
Okay. I like, getting back, just to do something about a little advertising for a moment. When you and Tom were talking yesterday about keeping things simple, and as you know, as I told you earlier, I love Tom Woods. The only reason why I support Dave Smith for president is because Tom Woods refuses to run. And I think Tom would probably appeal to a broader constituency. I understand why Dave is so popular, but Tom would be my man. So I love and admire the guy. But I insist, of course, on criticizing him where he's vulnerable. And in his interview with you yesterday, he made the same remark about low IQ people, or 10 points of IQ. And I wish he'd get off that particular bit. And but because you guys were then pointing out about simplicity. Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Got that memorized. And the point is, I would prefer that you say, I'm writing, that's for the 65 IQ people. I don't know that the 120 IQ people are going to understand it, but my story, as I told you earlier, was that my wife her property rights were being violated by somebody, to summarize the story in shorthand. And we had a guy who was definitely low IQ. He'd worked at a bouncer at a nightclub. He wasn't committing violence against anybody on our behalf, but he was doing something. And he kept saying, it's your property, and they won't get off your property. This restaurant that refused to leave. I mean, this guy had this guy understood something about property rights that the 130 IQ people might not understand at all. So I wish Tom would get off that particular, especially when we're talking about the simplicity of libertarianism. Part of our advantage is that the 65, 70 IQ people can readily understand us, and some of the 120 IQ people get convoluted and can't quite grasp it. So getting back to Murray, for example, Murray, in his speeches, lots of recordings exist of his speeches. I liked, for example, the way he introduced the incentive problem under socialism. That it reduces to who'll take out the garbage. Who'll do the dirty. Who'll take out the garbage. And he said, but they do have an answer for that. And then he gave it his gleeful cackle, which I always love to hear. He said, "Oh, it's socialist garbage. So of course they'll take out the socialist garbage." So that was Murray. He was able. Part of his genius was he was able to simplify, and I dare say, come to think of it, that he had, of course, he was a Jewish guy from Brooklyn, and Hayek, of course, had been raised in a totally different tradition. So Hayek's genius probably was not so much that he was able to simplify, even though if you read The Mirage of Social Justice, I think you'll find it's pretty simple, because he laces it with a whole lot of examples about all the problems we have in saying this person deserves merit. And again, as he puts it so succinctly, if you don't believe in the medieval concept of the just price, how can you believe in the medieval concept of the just wage? It's unplanned, and of course gets back to the Hayekian notion that the outcomes are just unplanned, and they just result from just the way in which people will operate freely in a free market, and how the allocations happen will not necessarily lead to the just wage or the just price that you think should prevail. Yeah.
So I very much agree with you on the IQ thing, and I think it's a rhetorical device that he's using. But depending on who I'm talking to, when they ask me where I came up with "don't hurt people and don't take their stuff," one version of that story is I wanted to tweet the entire 750 pages of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments in one sentence. That's sort of true, but it's also true that I stole it from your mom. And mom's common sense is, what did she teach you, right? Yeah. What did your mom teach you? Don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. And that, to me, is a profound wisdom. But some people that think they're super smart, they start to think that they're smarter than that common wisdom. And some of the most odious central planners I know, super high IQ people, they think they're smart enough to redesign the economy and replace that greater social intelligence that we were talking about with a plan. So I'm not sure that IQ in any way tells you how smart people are in that sense. Like, I'm not talking about your ability to do math, but your understanding of how the world works.
Even I would even dare say that Charles Murray, who's written a lot about IQ, the bell curve, and so on, that he's recently published yet another book in which he mentions IQ a lot, and where he readily concedes that so many other human attributes like compassion and empathy are beyond are not necessarily correlated with high or low IQ, and in a way, compassion and empathy is probably all you need to understand Matt's insight. I would say one thing. The one thing I just the other day when Dennis Pratt was lecturing, I interjected something else about property, where I guess the people of subtle mind start challenging you, or you start getting challenges from the socialists in the audience who are ever present in my mind, and I guess Bill Moore is ever present in yours. I'm curious to ask you about that part of your experience, but it's that. A point that George Reisman, who's an economist, made that we all have to agree that historically at any one point a lot of property was unjustly appropriated. A lot of land was given. The kings, the princes, they love to give out land. A lot of legitimate property rights were seized from others. There's a whole welter of unjust actions that you can't possibly unwind or redress. So then somebody might say, well, then how can you talk about legitimate property rights? Reisman's viewpoint, which I think is persuasive, is that the stain is wiped away if you let free market capitalism to operate for a generation or so. The stain is wiped away because my wife owns a building, small building on Bleecker Street, 5 Bleecker. We don't know who did she acquire it from. I mean, it probably was justly built and whoever, but we don't know. But she operates it. She's mixed her labor with it. She has earned the right over time to manage it. In a free market, it falls into the most competent hands, the people who can responsibly manage it, so that therefore we get a replication of that idea of mixing your labor with the soil, of mixing your labor with capital. And I think that's a key point to understand about free market capitalism. Again, because we have to cope with the idea that we inherit a history that wasn't clean capitalism, that was clearly filled with corruption.
So let me let's start to wrap this up.
Okay,
but
sure.
I still haven't had a chance, and I don't know. What was how did you discover liberty? What was your gateway drug?
Man, economy, and state. Yeah. No, I was privileged that Jeff Tucker actually years ago asked me to do an introduction to a collection of articles by essays by Murray Rothbard called Controversial Essays, 52 essays. And I began the essay by writing, it was nearly 40 years ago that Murray Rothbard changed my life. At this point, it's nearly 50 years ago. And of course, that, as I jokingly said to once when I was, Tom Woods gave me a Gene Epstein week, and Tom Woods said, this is the most irrelevant story to all of you. Who could possibly come to libertarianism by reading Man, Economy, and State? I said, yeah, but it's my story. I was studying economics at the New School. I was teaching economics, and so I was ready to drop out. I was getting soured. Left-wing economics wasn't offering me very much, which is what the New School was serving up, and mainstream economics, which I was pretty much forced to teach in undergraduate school. I had a teaching job. Was also souring me, and I just wanted to quit the whole business. I picked up Man, Economy, and State just a couple of times in the New School library, and then finally read it. And so that was my gateway, because it taught me something, of course, which echoes your viewpoint, that really Austrian economists or Austrian economics is sort of redundancy. That by the way, when Milton Friedman, who was basically mostly a mainstream economist, but had many insights, or any of them who are mainstream, when they actually just roll up their sleeves and give up the bullshit of mathematics, momentarily forget that they all are whoring after jobs running the Federal Reserve or being chairman of the Federal Reserve, momentarily forgetting that, which both of which completely taints their discipline, that they want to regard it as a branch of physics to make it obscure, and they basically want to think top down in order to serve the rich and powerful, in order to serve the interests of the state. Once they forget that, which many of them do, they sound like Austrians. If you read so many of Milton Friedman's better essays, he's sounding like an Austrian. He's basically using simple logic for the way people reason, act in markets, and the markets as a process. And so that's what I discovered by reading Man, Economy, and State. And also, what was a special gift to me, which I could go into at some length, was that Rothbard then had digressions in which he goes after some of the mainstream concepts. One of the funniest ones being monopolistic competition, and how hilarious that is. In fact, I'd read about it. Paul Samuelson, in his textbook, uses the example of a barber shop. Joe's barber shop is all screwed up because it's a monopolistically competitive. It's competitive because it's a barber shop. It's monopoly because it's run by Joe. And the non sequitur from that is that Joe's barbershop is operating with excess capacity. I digress on that, but it's the funniest aspect of mainstream economics, which Rothbard helped me prick, and showing that it's all based on the geometry of how you draw your average cost curves. And Rothbard actually showed that you could draw the curves in two other ways, and you could resolve this problem that Samuelson thought exists under what he liked to call monopolistic competition. There were other digressions in that book that made a difference to me, and so then I was at that point I guess I was working for the, that's right. I dropped out of college. I was dropped out of teaching, and I went to Wall Street. I worked for the New York Stock Exchange. But I spent then the next several years haunting the laissez-faire bookshop downtown. I lived uptown, and browsing and buying a couple of books. So I sort of read through all of the Austrian canon over several years, and then I got a job as a columnist with Barron's, and did that for a quarter of a century. And of course, I had problems in different ways. I had to cover the numbers, and I guess part of what I contribute to an understanding of economics is that I do understand all of the official numbers, both government and private, because that's what I covered. Every once in a while, if you're writing in a column, not everybody realizes you're an Austrian because you have to cater to who's out there. But then when I became book review editor, I was able to bring in a number of Austrians to review books for me at Barron's. And then oftentimes, of course, my column made it pretty clear that my orientation was in an Austrian direction. So I've had pretty much of a joyride. And I guess part of the way I was able to think in terms of my role is that, look, I'm not exactly writing for the New York Times the way, amazingly, Henry Hazlitt wrote for the New York Times. Nobody at the New York Times would touch me, but at least I was working for a pretty much mainstream publication with a 500,000 readers who were interested in the stock market, but their polls showed that about 1/3 of the readership read me. So that was like, nearly 100,000 people. So I thought, well, I'm bringing Austrians here. I'm writing from an Austrian tradition. I'm behind enemy lines a little bit, contributing my little portion to what goes on. And I left Barron's a couple of years ago, and now I've been having fun talking to people like Matt Kibbe.
So when did you found the Soho Forum? When was the first one?
That was in the fall of 2016.
Okay.
And there I felt there was sort of a need. There are debating societies that they're too much 2 against 2. I should add, with respect to capitalism, that part of what I was a little bit bothered by is that any time there was a debate about capitalism, and that was held by one particular debating society and some others, it was always putting capitalism on trial. It was basically, how good is capitalism? And it was really capitalism compared. You bring up a couple of socialists on board, and they say, hey, bosses are, there are lots of mean bosses and people have to work, and they're basically never asked to define socialism. They're always comparing capitalism with some kind of vague notion of how we can all love each other and have a family together, and never was capitalism compared with socialism. It was a criminal trial for capitalism, which, to quote Schumpeter, it stands its trial before judges who have the sentence of death in their pockets. They're going to pass it, whatever defense they hear. The only success victorious defense can possibly achieve is a change in the indictment. So this is capitalism's hanging judges. So I knew it should be a custody trial. Who should have custody of the economy, socialists or capitalists? So force the socialists to define what they mean by socialism. What do they want? How do they envision the economy should be run? So that was part of the reason why I wanted to create my own debating society, so I could have legitimate debates about socialism versus capitalism versus socialism, rather than just putting capitalism on trial, and also make it one-on-one rather than the soundbite kind of thing that they did at many of the debating societies that I objected to. I had no experience raising money. I just happened to know Don Smith, who got turned on by my idea. Once I told him that I won't accept a salary, I'll do it for nothing. Which would be a labor of love. It continues to be a labor of love. I get an office paid for, but I don't take any salary to run it. And so it was lucky that I appeared before this group, of investors who run the Don Smith Family Foundation, and they were very skeptical that I could make a success of it. So I said, okay, why not finance the first 4 events? So our first 4 events we were selling out. Then we started to sell tickets and earn a good income from that, and so it's been the most satisfying thing I've ever done. I can claim to be a social entrepreneur finally in my life, after having been a freelance writer a little bit, and then having been a salaried person for most of my career. Finally, I created something not quite as grandiose as what Matt Kibbe has done, but something at least that contributes. And we stick to our last. I love interviews. I love lectures. I love all kinds of other events. Even panel discussions are sometimes okay. although I sometimes object to those. But so we're just a one-on-one debating society. We stick to our knitting. Yeah.
Don Smith was a hero. Like he was the guy that would always put his money where his mouth was.
Oh, you knew Don? Yeah.
Yes. And wrap up with this. You have the first live Soho Forum coming up.
Coming up in September.
Knockdown, 8th. Drag out.
Well,
fight to the death.
Well, no character assassination is allowed at the Soho Forum. And I was
just words, please.
Just words, but no character assassination. I permitted it once when Walter Block called Nick Gillespie a vile human being, and that was just funny. Even though Walter didn't mean it to be funny, it was funny. But we don't allow character assassination. September 8th, we're having a debate where we hopefully find a place on Bleecker Street. The place to be announced. We're looking at a couple of places, and there will be a party afterwards at our loft apartment. So that's an attraction. We have a loft apartment that can accommodate a little over 100 people, and so when the Mises Caucus showed up, we had 180 people in that loft apartment, and they somehow didn't mind rubbing against each other the way they did. And then we're having Scott Horton versus Bill Kristol October 4th, and that is going to be at a big theater called Symphony Space at Upper Broadway. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to do an interactive, tomorrow morning here, just for those of you who are present. I look forward to doing an interactive on worker need, employer agreed, which is a phrase I got from a good, simple phrase from George Reisman, who had his moments explaining things simply, and we'll try to explain how wages are determined even with employer agreed and worker need, but then get into some politically incorrect parts of it, including, of course, mentioning Hayek's part about merit. So we are going back to New York for our Soho Forum, but we've done 2 debates here up at the Pork Fest, and we certainly will do more in the future at Pork Fest. And I wanted to ask you about, you don't appear on Bill Maher anymore? What happened?
No, not anymore.
But I mean,
I just don't do that stuff anymore.
Well, that's real sound bites. That's real. That's a little bit.
I like this format better.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like I would love to have a thoughtful conversation with Bill Maher because I think he's a really interesting guy.
Okay. Yeah.
But the show is sort of designed to be a shout fest.
Yes, indeed.
And there are limits to what you can accomplish doing that.
Right. Yeah. No, and that of course is my emphasis with the Soho Forum. If it's one-on-one, people are up there. They speak for 15 minutes. There's a risk that they may be boring you, absolutely. But I want to give them a chance to actually express their thoughts. And even 15 minutes is sometimes a brief period. So that's indeed my stock and trade. And the sound bites. I mean, what's his name? The most popular guy on Fox. It's just painful to listen to sometimes.
Yeah.
It's a ping pong game where you get fired. I used to appear because I was at Barron's, and of course we were part of Fox. We were part of Rupert Murdoch's empire, and I always knew it was always a test. Ask me a question, I get 2 sentences out. Am I going to be able to get a 3rd sentence out? Very rarely. They'll interrupt you with the next question once you're on your 3rd sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you guys have your reading assignment. Yeah. Rothbard, Hayek, Soul.
Man Economy.
Mirage
of social justice
and
knockdown decisions.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
What is that? That's like law. That was amazing. Where can I get more content just like that? It's a great question. You're clearly a discerning consumer of the best content. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, and click the bell. And if you're consuming podcasts, go to Apple, Stitcher, anywhere you get them. I'm in. Kibbe on Liberty, honest conversations with interesting people.